Greetings, friends. My name is Segma Asval, and I work as Program Executive with the Commission of the Churches on International Affairs of the World Council of Churches. Together with my colleagues Peter Cruchley from Council for World Mission and Sephiroza Carroll from the WCC Missions from the Margin, I am happy to welcome you to the last day of this online conference on Anti-Racist in Christ, Ecumenical Christian Repentance, Reflection and Action on Racial Discrimination and Xenophobia. Before we start the session, let me guide you into some technical aspects. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available soon on the WCC YouTube channel. Please subscribe to the channel for more content on the work that we do. During the session, if you have questions and comments for the panelists, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. My co-organizers and I will convey them to the moderator and panelists for their consideration. In case of a need for further technical support, please reach out in writing to WCC/CWM technical support team via the Zoom chat box. Today's session will be focusing on anti-racist markers for churches. As in previous days, our moderator will be Reverend Philip Vinod Peacock. He is an ordained minister in the Church of North India and currently serves with the World Communion of Reformed Churches as the Executive Secretary for Justice and Witness. Without further delay, Philippe, please guide us in this conversation.
Thank you so much, Segma, and welcome to each one of you to this final webinar in our series of webinars on anti-racist in Christ. Yesterday, we concentrated on the question of what models of engagement we could have to dismantle, displace, and decolonize racism around the world. We began by looking at Black Lives Matter and the alliances, the global alliances that were built around this. However, it was quickly brought to our attention that this was also part of a colonial process where the events in the United States of America quickly proliferated around the world, calling for global solidarity. But other cases of human rights violations and brutalities were perhaps silenced in this process. So where were the calls for West Papuan lives matter, for Dalit lives matter? And therefore the question of who is at the table and the table itself as a metaphor was raised. While we recognize that there were several tables, yet there needed to be an interconnection between these various forms of tables. And that at the big table, where the resources were, that is where marginalized people want to be, but definitely needed to have their just share of resources from. We've ended on a rather unusual note, which was not perhaps fully answered, where we recognize the need of not just decolonizing global structures, but there has to be a decolonization of the ecumenical movement itself. And this led, of course, to several questions that were unanswered. Perhaps today is a good place to pick up from where we left off yesterday. Today, we speak of the markers of an anti-racist church. Traditionally, the church has been spoken of as having the marks, the wounds perhaps, of being one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. Today, what marks us as an anti-racist church? What sets us apart? What wounds or whose wounds do we bear? And to help us answer this very, very deep set of questions are a number of expert panelists. Our first panelist today is Frank Shikane. He is presently the moderator of the World Council of Churches Commission of the Churches on International Affairs. He is an emeritus pastor of the Apostolic Faith Mission of South Africa and has formerly served on the National Executive Committee of the African National Congress. As someone who was an activist and then worked activist in apartheid South Africa, seeking to dismantle it, and then working in the new South Africa, he brings to us a wealth of experience. Sepiuta Hala Ape Ape is a Tongan missionary, was born to Tongan missionary parents, but born and raised in Fiji. She is currently an ordained minister, one of the few young women ordained ministers, and serves in the Anglican Diocese of Polynesia. She has also served in government and is passionate, among many other things, about preaching the word, music, caring for God's creation, and a love for travel. Henrietta Hutabarat Lebang was formerly General Secretary of the Christian Conference of Asia and is presently the pastor of the Toraja Church, Indonesia. She serves as chair for the advisory board of the Communion of Churches in Indonesia, is general chairperson of the Indonesian Bible Society, a member of the World Council of Churches Central Committee, and a member of the Indonesian Board of National Education Standard. She comes with a wealth of experience in the ecumenical movement, and we welcome her to this webinar. Torsten Moritz holds a PhD in political sciences from the Free University of Berlin, and he has been involved in the leadership of various pan-European youth networks since the late 1990s. Since the early 2000s, he's been working for the Churches Commission for Migrants in Europe, and since 2018, he is serving as the General Secretary of this organization. In his capacity, he co-chairs the European NGO platform on asylum and migration. Teora Rountree is descended from the tribal groups of Nagai Turearu in Northland. She describes herself as a lay preacher in Auckland and has served for many years at Trinity College. She has worked as a researcher and tutor for the University of Auckland, including interdepartmental grants and government contracted work. Her focus really has been on decolonizing theology. And so, friends, we see that these 5 panelists that we have today are those who have one foot in the church, but also one foot within the context of government. And I hope that they will be able to bring to us that much necessary conversation of how we can bridge the gap between the church and the state, particularly in building policies and theology towards our anti-racism work. May I remind you that today's webinar, like the others that we have had before, is not going to be in a lecture style. Instead, we are going to have a conversation in which we invite you as participants to enter into as well. You can make your comments in the question and answer box, and there are moments in this webinar in which we will be able to answer these questions. And so to begin, I would like to ask the first question to all our panelists by starting with Sepe. Who do you see leading the way for anti-racist work in your context?
Thank you, Philip. Firstly, ni sambula vinaka, malole lei talofa lava, namaste, noa ia, ni hao. Kia ora and greetings to you all from the South Pacific. I greet you all in the languages of my context that I'm familiar with. My context being a Tongan female ordained minister serving in the Anglican province of Aotearoa, New Zealand and Polynesia, born and raised in a multiracial, multicultural country called Fiji, a former British colony. In our context in the islands, in the South Pacific, we live and we thrive and we work well as communities, or as villages, or as settlements. Community is meaningful for us, and there's always a sense of community in all that we do. So to help me answer this question, while we still hold dear to us the remnants of the colonial days, such as the leadership being about the one with the most power, a top-down approach or hierarchy to lead the way, and the rest follow, one of the gifts of the islands is that we work together, living in community with one another. No one is left behind, we all move together. So therefore, for me, I see it's a community of people at the grassroots, the churches in the local context, in the local communities, the space where there's a lot of interaction amongst the multiracial community. Where this happens, I believe these are the people that help to lead the way of anti-racist work in our context. So it's like a shared leadership approach. And I think that's a great model which we would like to share with the rest of the world. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you so much for that very profound answer. Let's move on now to asking Torsten, how do you see, who do you see leading the way forward for anti-racism work in your context?
Thanks, Philip. Let me, before I answer to that, briefly offer a reflection that we, of course, in Europe have very different situations. We have 47 countries, and a handful of these countries, the question is obviously related to the colonial past. You have the grandchildren of those who were the colonizers living next to those who were affected, who were colonized, who were enslaved, who were raped, who were sold due to colonialism. And then you have quite a lot of countries where the response to these questions is, yeah, but we had no colonies, so the whole issue is no problem. But where you have lots of issues of indigenous people or ethnic minority like the Roma. So the context is very different from country to country. What we've seen particularly over the last year, and I think that is very, very encouraging, is that within the churches, there's a reminder of saying racism, wasn't there something in the 60s and the 70s and with apartheid? So should we need to revisit what we've done at that time and the discussions? And the second point, people of color in the churches have, I think, more fervently begun to network. They've begun to network, empowering one another, and there's allies. What was noticeable is that as the follow-up to the Black Lives Matter movement, for the first time, there was articulation of people who are enjoying privilege, white privilege, in the churches saying, we want this to change. And I think that's something which is very hopeful. But as I've said, in a lot of countries, the reaction will be racism, we have no stake in that. So there's a long discussion we need to have.
Thank you, Torsten, and thank you for complexifying the multiple layers of what is easily described as Europe. So thank you very much for that. I mean, someone who comes from perhaps a single country, but which is so diverse in its culture, Henrietta, how would you reflect on this question? Who do you see as leading the anti-racism work?
Greetings from Indonesia, multicultural, multi-religious country. Salam, peace to you all. I think there are several people who are dealing with this. How do we lead out or working on against the racism? Yeah, some churches actively doing this, because it is realized that also within the church itself, sometimes there is a discrimination, well, for whatever reason. Yeah, ecumenical body, such as a Communion of Churches in Indonesia, work very hard for advocacy, especially with regard to discrimination based on culture, based on gender, based on religion. And in the context of Indonesia, also interfaith organizations are working together with the churches to address this concern. And those who lead the way to anti-racist work in Indonesia, basically working on how to overcome the prejudice embedded in culture, in ongoing interaction of the people in the church as well as in the society. So I think one of the criteria is whether that group or institution working intentionally, having intentional effort to overcome the prejudice and to build the just community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Frank Shikane, with your wealth of experience in pre and post-apartheid, who would you say is leading the anti-racism work now in your context?
Well, good morning from South Africa on the southern tip of the continent. I would like to answer this question differently. Bring in history and bring in the present. In terms of our historical experience, clearly those who are on the receiving side of racism are the only ones who can say what this thing is and what needs to be done about it. And those who are perpetrators find it very difficult to actually see it. And we saw it within the church where we believe in the same God, but people become racist within the church. And that's the historical perspective. The second part of it is that we in South Africa, and it would apply mostly on the African continent, we are majority Christian. And so the Christian understanding becomes critical about anti-racism and getting rid of racism. And because of that, we look at the church and say, are you what Christ meant you to be? And the answer is the church is not what Christ meant it to be. The church is a reflection of our broken history as we came along over centuries and reflect and embody the brokenness rather than what we are supposed to be. If we had to be what we are supposed to be, then we ended up with the Kairos document in South Africa, where we said there's a status quo church which supports the status quo irrespective of the injustices committed. Then there is what we call church theology, which is really making statements and do nothing about it and live with the injustices and racism. And we then said there must be prophetic theology, which is where we expect the church to be critical about injustices in society, including the issue of racism. And I think that's where we stand. And I believe as we are now, we're battling with racism. It doesn't go away even after our freedom. To say, how are we going to get rid of it? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that you have raised a very important question for us, that one would like the answer to be, who do we see as leading the anti-racism work to be the church? But the church just isn't there as yet. Can we wrap up this round of questions by moving now to Theora and asking her the same question? In your context, who do you see leading the anti-racism work today?
Kia ora tata, I te tuatahi me mihi atu kia koutou katoa. Greetings to everyone from Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's the evening here, so I will say ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Perhaps just to begin with, also, I think the historiography of Aotearoa is one of a colonized people, like most of the people who have spoken already. What we are seeing now is this move or shift towards a type of decolonization. I don't know that we're talking anti-racism at a great level in Aotearoa. we are still kind of reconciling this decolonization process. And for many of us, it's about a recognition of intergenerational trauma as a result of that colonial oppression that continues today. Colonial ideology and practice continues to be imposed upon our Indigenous peoples, from education to health, etc. So we are still in a phase, and it might seem strange to those outside of Aotearoa, because we have purported to have some great race relations in Aotearoa, New Zealand. That's not necessarily the case. As someone who's grown up in this country and experienced significant racism every day of my life here. And I want to say also that it's not necessarily the churches that is leading any kind of decolonization or anti-racist work within this context. The Human Rights Commission here has, over the past 10 years, done some significant work and campaigns around racism. Not-for-profit organizations and treaty-based organizations have also been doing significant work in this field. The church is a late bloomer in my experience. There are some parts of churches that have been doing this work quietly, in particular the Māori Council of Churches, which is a Māori ecumenical interdenominational body that has been operating since the 1980s. But I think under some strong pressure and duress from both the government and within our church organizations. So unfortunately, the situation is not as bright and shiny as people may think in Aotearoa here. I think there's a lot of work being done at the grassroots social activist level. And there are younger members within churches that are at the forefront of that work. So I think younger generations are moving quicker than some of us old cronies. Kia ora.
Thank you, Tearo. I'm going to ask you to stay on, actually, and continue this as we move into our next question. You spoke of the church as being a late bloomer on the racial justice question. Perhaps now we need to use some imagination, but what does an anti-racist church do? If you imagine the church as being anti-racist, what would it actually do?
Well, I think perhaps from my perspective, I belong to a church that prescribes a bicultural imperative and has since 1983, which means that we have shared power between the Indigenous peoples and everybody else within the context of our Methodist Church. So this sounds exciting, and it sounds justice-seeking, and it has been. But there have also been some real difficulties because this bicultural imperative has not necessarily been fully ingrained and embedded within the whole church. I think in an ideal world, maybe an anti-racist, particularly Methodist church, is fundamentally focused around word and deed. So perhaps it needs to be confessional, meaning it is truth-telling and justice-seeking. So always working consistently to decenter and dismantle destructive systems and processes of power. This has to be consistent. It can't just be we've reached a destination. It has to be continuous. I think a anti-racist church also has to be transformational, meaning it needs to be transformed by that manifestation of God's love in the world, which means churches and society have to be able to move with the times. And that means being a little bit fearless and a little bit radical. I think particularly in my context, people are very complacent. I think anti-racist church also has to be missional, meaning its mission needs to reflect an imminent accountability. So those who are in power must be accountable to those who are not. So there's this sort of social, political, and economic implications of what it means to be an anti-racist church. And accepting of some of the consequences, that's something that has been difficult in our church context. When Māori make a determination, it has been difficult for particularly our white Pākehā church members to actually accept and acknowledge those consequences as a part of the sharing of power. And so over generations, it takes a little bit of time, I think. So I'm saying confessional, transformational, and missional.
Thank you. That was very, very beautifully put. Torsten, in your long history of work with migration and in Europe, you have seen both sides of this. On the one hand, you yourself have spoken about, churches that said, oh, racism is not our problem. But on the other hand, we have seen churches that have been involved in creating sanctuary. I mean, we saw that in The Hague. We know of these rescue ships. So you have experiences of both. Can you tell us more of what an anti-racist church should look like?
Yeah, and maybe I would tune it down a little and say, what do we on the way towards being an anti-racist church need to do? Okay. Because I think everything else would be fooling ourselves. Let's be very honest. We a couple of weeks ago had an event where we were asking what have European churches done and learned from Black Lives Matter, and it was a very mixed bag, let's put it this way. I would like to focus on three things where I see a need for a process and uncomfortable truth. That's theology, that's history, and that's structure. And I'll start with theology, which of course should and is the foundation of everything we do. We need to see where we are with theology. I would hope that blatantly racist, exclusionary supremacy theology is very, very marginal in Europe. But have we really said goodbye to the theology which justified, motivated colonialism, which was establishing the theory of the superiority of the whites? I think we haven't. I think there's very little reflection of that. And I think we need to look at how are our faculties of theology staffed? Have they really cut ties with the old theology, or are we still there? And of course, we know that the Bible can be a very uncomfortable book, particularly the Old Testament, if we read it with anti-racist eyes. But I think an honest assessment where we are and what we haven't done yet and how we need to transform theology is the first one. The second one is history. As I said, be honest about the role European churches have played in colonializing and justifying colonialization and are still profiting from it. And we have over the last year seen, as in many places, astonishing thing, like the church in Berlin being very much, we support Black Lives Matter, and yet the Berlin Mission Society has a little exhibition in its ground floor which praises the colonial work of that mission society in Southern Africa. So I think we have a long way to go looking at history and saying, where have we been? And the third point, and that's where it often becomes relatively controversial, is to say, we need to look at our structures. Why is it that the church goers in Europe are increasingly diverse? And why is it that so little of that is reflected in the leadership or the staffing of our churches? Once again, in Berlin, a little working party of people of colors and their allies went to the bishop and say, where's the diversity in our staff? And that's when the discussion became very heated and very uncomfortable, because it's about power and privilege, access to finances and decision makings. And yeah, we will need to have uncomfortable discussions there. But I think we need to have a process where we start with really mapping where we are. I'll say a word about that in a minute. Then really, I think some kind of confession is necessary to say we have done that. And then really looking at transformation to come at the end, maybe to reconciliation and healing. But I often feel that people enjoying privilege in the churches are coming, oh, we want reconciliation, we patch it up, without taking the first couple of steps. So I really see it as a process where we can't take the fourth step before the first one. That for me would be some indicator, some points of a process And then we might at some point start about becoming an anti-racist church, but I think we're far from it.
Thank you very much, Torsten. That was not just very clear, but shows a clear path forward. I would like to now direct this question to Henrietta and ask from her Indonesian perspective, but also from an Asian perspective, really, what does an anti-racist church do? And friends, let me remind you that you can put your questions in the Q&A, and these will, of course, be addressed.
Yes, Philip, I think first of all is to recognize or being aware about the presence of discrimination in the society, in the church. Unless we recognize this reality, we will just take it for granted that there is no discrimination there. So I think it's very important, especially to realize the hierarchical structure that sometimes becomes the problematic, which exclude people. Repentance. And the third one is to continuously making an effort to transformation of the way of thinking, transformation of theology. How do you see people who are different than you? I mean, in a pluralistic context with varieties, backgrounds of people, it's very important to see people as image of God, whether that is exist in the church, and also to how do we treat people who are different than us. The other aspect is to find a metaphor in a wisdom tradition in the society that can enhance the understanding, the inclusive understanding of community, strengthen that inclusive understanding of community, respect and support each other for the welfare, for justice and peace in the community. I think these are some of the aspects that has to be reflected in the life of the church, which work toward against the racism. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And finally, to Frank. Frank, you spoke about these three things that were part of the Kairos document. You know, a state theology, a church theology, and a prophetic theology. My question to you is, what would happen if the church actually took on a prophetic theology? What would that look like? You'll have to unmute yourself.
I mean, the church we were looking forward to, it's a church that would be honest about the reality it was facing, be humble about it, and realize that power makes you not to recognize the injustices that you are doing. You needed to look at things from the point of view of the marginalized, the oppressed, and listen more. But, you know, I would like to say, Philip, you know, I would like to say for a church, I like the theme anti-racism in Christ. You see, the best example for me of what should happen to a church, it's a radical transformation. And if you take the church in South Africa, it went through baptism of fire, as I would call it, from Cottesloe. For those who know it, the message to the people of South Africa, 69, the program to combat racism, which divided the World Council of Churches because you had colonial tendencies within it and history. And then we ended up in the 80s where there was a huge conflict, which made churches to think about what it means to be church. And therefore, even the WCC, if you look at the WCC, from the colonial WCC to when independent countries from the developing countries came to the table, the thinking of the WCC changed. Where the problem is now is that racism is embedded in the power of the economy. And that's what we are dealing with in South Africa, even in the world. Racism is embedded in the power of the economy. And we may be free politically, But in terms of the economy, it's still owned by others. The world's economy is owned by those who think of the world in a racist way. And that's what we need to deal with at a global level. In South Africa, we've reached a stage where the churches, it's no more a problem. There's nobody who now is a racist here in South Africa. We're looking for them. They have now disappeared. But it's expressed in the form of not political power, but economic power. And for me, unless you change the dynamics, like, for instance, people of African descent, if I have to talk about it, if you don't change the dynamics of the power of the economy, you're not going to get rid of racism, because racism is related to the power of the economy.
Thank you very much. And thank you for highlighting the question of racism actually being embedded in a material reality of how the economic system works. And I think what you said about the people who run the economy of the world are racist, and that really also perpetuates itself in how racism continues to be embedded in our communities. We have a few questions that have come up in the chat box. There is this question from Nikki Ashford, and she asks that she says that it's rather interesting that the colonizers tend towards secularism and being post-Christian, while the colonized still somewhat hold to the religious ways of the colonizer. And we know this is true. Is it that there is no room for the colonizer and colonized to genuinely coexist when the colonized are taking primary leadership roles in evangelizing? And I think perhaps if I'm reading into this question a bit, and perhaps Nicole Ashwood could clarify in the chat box again, that does the church create a space where the colonized and colonizer can come together, but not on unequal terms, but rather through justice, working in a process towards reconciliation? And I'm going to ask Theora to answer this question first, and then move to Torsten, because he was very strong on this question of process.
So my take on this question would be that in our context, as I said previously, we have been operating as a bicultural church, working to share power within both the structures and the governance of our church. So basically colonizer and colonized attempting to work together. Sometimes this has worked, and the majority of the time it hasn't. And there is continuous work that has to be done all the time. It's not something that we have this goal here and we've met that goal and we're good to go. It is consistently something that you have to work on, has been my experience anyway.
Thank you. Torsten?
Yeah, I wouldn't yet say there's no room for colonizers and colonized to coexist. And I think we need to go beyond coexistence, but it is extremely difficult. And just to flag, one of the debates we obviously have in Europe at the moment is that Christians from outside Europe come in, some with a clear idea of re-missionizing secular Europe. And that is a conflict on many, many levels, to which many European churches and Christians react with saying, yeah, but that's the thing we did 100 years ago. You're completely out of date, which is once again creating a superiority. We as Europeans have moved beyond that. But indeed, it gets complex when we work on the unity. And apart from the race issue, the issue of, for example, gender or sexuality in the churches comes in, and we have a massive clash there. But also that is sometimes used as an excuse not to coexist, not to lead the debate together, but to say, yeah, but they're having a very different theology, these people, or in many mainstream churches, if you have, for example, people of African descent, relatively newly arrived migrants, a lot of mainstream churches will tell you they're all Pentecostal, nothing to do with us. And if you can start with that argument, say there's Christians and you per se say they have nothing to do with us because they belong to other denominations, then there's something fundamentally wrong with the way you're operating. So I'm not totally pessimistic, but it's a long way also in this aspect.
Thank you. There is a question in the chat box about what is the role of liberation theology in making the church an anti-racist and decolonizing church. And I will start with Sepiuta to answer this question and then ask Frank to follow on.
Thank you. My understanding of this is just going back to what you said at the beginning about the wounds. And I think when we experience the wounds happening, not just in our churches or amongst races, but in our communities, it's the suffering that brings people together and working together towards, I think, towards addressing issues that are happening in the world today.
Thank you. Frank?
You know, I would like to start from a definition of what I understand liberation theologies to be about, basically, because I think that will help. As a label, it becomes a problem. For me, liberation theology, it's about people getting involved in the praxis of liberation of those who are victims of society, and you know, and then reflect on that experience of freeing yourself and working together to free yourself. And when you reflect on it, you end up with what you would call liberation theology. We called it praxis during those old days. And so what is critical is that liberation theology helps the church to be subsumed with the victims of racism and identify with them, get involved in the struggles to get rid of racism, and then you then get transformed in the process of doing that, which means you become liberated as a church as well. When you work with oppression, you are bound to be liberated. The opposite of that, of course, is that if you are enforcing an unjust system, it dehumanizes you as well. And that's why soldiers get dehumanized and behave differently. So I am of the view that we as church need to be where the people are and their experiences, reflect on it, and then develop a theological understanding that enables us to be part of the redemptive action and repentance of people who are working in that type of an environment.
Thank you very much. Henrietta, over the last 4 days, in various ways, the issue of the Papua situation has come to the foreground in many, many ways. I mean, even yesterday when Jimmy Bhagwan was speaking. So the specific question that we have here, but I would like to ask you to answer it in a more broad way to highlight the situation as well. The question asks, how can the National Council of Churches, and I'm supposing this is the National Council of Churches in Indonesia, deal with the Papua situation?
Yes. Yeah, as we all know about the human rights violation which is going on in Papua for some times already. And the Council of Churches or the Communion of Churches in Indonesia has done many things to do some advocacy work with regard to the people in Papua, especially to ask the government to stop all this human rights violation which is going on in Papua. That is very strong, a very strong voice of the Communion of Churches in Indonesia after discussing it with leaders of the churches in Papua. There are a few times already consultation to understand the dynamics of Friends society in Papua. And this result of the consultation was also shared with the churches in Indonesia to express the solidarity with the people in Papua. And many times, the Communion of Churches in Indonesia strongly speaks to the government about the situation in Papua, how to bring peace and justice, especially justice in Papua, and also to work together with the leaders of the Papuan church to bring this issue to the notice, to the action, I would like to say, to the action of the government, and especially the military, to stop the human rights violation which often happen in Papua up to now. Pastoral visit has been done, but also in the there are many other problems here that happen there. It's so complicated, and killings happen there. That's all recognized, and the Council, the Communion of Churches in Indonesia, tried to work together with the churches in Papua how to end this situation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We move on to our next set of questions, actually, not from the participants, but really as a conversation. We began by saying that today's conversation is going to be about the marks of the church. And we all know, because in many of our traditions, we repeat this every Sunday, that the church is described as one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. Now, if we had to speak about the marks of an anti-racist church, what would those be like? And I will ask Frank Shikane to lead.
Yeah, I thought about it when I saw the notes about this conversation. And I thought the best way to put it, the marks of an anti-racist church would be reflected in our experience in South Africa of what those who know about it, the Elof Commission, where the apartheid system wanted to really shut down the ministry of the church because it was critical of racism and wanted to end it. And the whole world leadership of the church descended in South Africa from different traditions, different countries, to come and say to South Africa, we are part of this church in South Africa. We are one body. And if you touch it, you are touching all of us. And their pain is our pain. Even the issue of foreign funding, they were saying they want to stop foreign funding. They said there's no foreign funding here. We are one body of Christ, and therefore money that moves within the church is within the same body. And I thought it was a moment which was symbolic about the oneness of the church, that you can't have one part of the church suffering and the other does not care about it. And I don't want to bring the issue of Palestine here because it's very critical, Palestine, Israel. We can't ignore that and continue as if nothing is happening and people are brutalized on a day-to-day basis. That's the first marker for me. The second marker, it's really the issue of the apostolic. It's the issue about, the Catholic, holy. That's okay for me. But the apostolic, I would want to turn it around and say, it's not just about succession. It is about being the sent ones. That's really what apostolic talks about, which is missional. And therefore, we as a church are the sent ones to deal with all these injustices that manifest themselves in society. And that's why, for me, if church becomes church and we are not what we are supposed to be, we should be change agents in every situation where there is injustice.
Thank you very much. you have done very good work in reinterpreting one and apostolic. And thank you very much for highlighting this Palestinian question, because as we talk about colonialism, that is one place that continues to be colonized, and the brutality that goes along with it. But I'm going to push you on one thing. Would you say that a mark of the anti-racist church today, and reformulating perhaps the Nicene Creed, is reparations?
Yeah, that's what we are now dealing with. I mean, this forum may not know that we have got an African diaspora conference coming in October. And the issues of reparations are critical in that conversation, because you see, you can't impoverish people over many years and disadvantage them over many years, and then say, let's start and run, we are equal. It doesn't work like that. I think it's important for us, if we act in solidarity with one another, to realize that we need to do more to make sure that people who were left in an island in the Caribbean after slaves were freed and they just got abandoned there, and you expect them to survive when they were forcefully removed from elsewhere and dumped in that place. There are things that the world needs to do that will change the equation of racism. As long as if poverty is associated with color of people, racism will sustain. As long as if, for instance, violence is associated with specific people, color of people, then racism will sustain. Let me just say one thing, because I think it's very important and people missed it. When we dealt with program to combat racism, the key issue was the money supporting the terrorists. But actually the same money, if you take the governments where they give churches money, the same money was producing weapons of mass destruction in South Africa. And they couldn't see the relationship between the money that supports this system and the resistance of the people on the other side. I think for me, that's very critical. We need to be able to go behind the cover and failure of the church to see the reality we are dealing with. And you know, as I'm saying, Israel, Palestine is a critical example.
Thank you very much. I'd like to move this same question to Henrietta and ask her, what do you think are the marks of an anti-racist church?
Yeah, I think self-reliance of the churches in theology, human resources, and material resources is very important. For us in Indonesia, the churches are the fruits of missionary work in the past, in the early 20th century. And a lot of dependency of the churches to so-called their mother churches. Until the church realize that, you know, they have to develop their own theology and in the concrete context where they are coming, in which they are, I think, you know, the dependency will continue. So a transformation of theology is one of the important things which lead towards human resources development as well as material resources. And I think the churches in Indonesia is working with that. The churches in Asia also working on that. You know, identity of the church is very important as marks of the anti-racist church. Yeah. Secondly, the different denominations that we have in Indonesia. How do we walk together? How do we walk together? The mark is that how do we respect the differences of the churches, the background of the churches, overcoming the prejudices against each other. Yeah, this is sometimes becomes the hindrance to work together, walking together ecumenically. So the third one is that the new reality that we are facing, the economic power that dominating the people, which create injustices. In the terms of globalization, we need the spirituality against greediness of the people. People tend to look for profit-oriented society. People look to and begin to hit each other. Conflict happens in the society because of this reason. Yeah. So I think, you know, it's very important to develop, the church develop spirituality that resist, that go against discrimination, especially based on economic, and of course also that related to the status, social status, education, and also in the context of pluralistic society, the different religions, how do the churches work together with people of other faiths? That is very important in Asia, because Christians are, in terms, I don't like to use this term, minority, in terms of the number actually. You know, how to be the creative community, Christian communities working together with people of other faith to address the social issue, to address injustices. We cannot, in Indonesia, in Asia in general, work only alone to overcome the issue of justice and peace. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henrietta, for raising this question about building interfaith alliances for this kind of work, and that actually being a mark of the identity of the church going forward. Seppi, how would you reflect on this entire question of the marks of an anti-racist church?
The words that come to mind are, firstly, when we talk about the church being one, is diversity. So the church is one, but appreciating diversity, and that's the beauty of appreciating that we are diverse rather than being different. Another word is being inclusive and appreciating people who are different from us. And thirdly is, like what was mentioned before, equity, where we all have equal access, resources are shared, and we are all able to work together. So those are the three words that I thought of: being diverse, inclusive, and equity.
Thank you. Diverse, inclusive, and equity. But Seppi, I'm going to ask you to stay on and answer this particular question. Over the last 4 days, actually, and perhaps for a very, very long time, we do know that Christian mission has been described itself in these messianic, salvific ways, but really has contributed to the furtherance of colonialism, the furtherance of domination, the furtherance of slavery, and legacies of slavery that still continue. Do you think there is a space, perhaps, or do you think there is a possibility that Christian mission can be rerouted now to enable the embodiment of redemption?
Thank you. Well, I tried my best to prepare an answer because I was a bit confused with the question. But firstly, I do agree that the Christian mission has rerouted a few times, and there's also still room for Christian mission to advance. Speaking from my context, Christian mission in our part of the world has evolved over the years, from the legacy of white Western mission, white Christianity, white missionaries coming, white Jesus. Christian mission has changed a lot, mainly in terms of us ourselves rediscovering God's presence, encountering God, and experiencing his movement wherever we are. Our identity is important to us, and our churches also focus on contextual theology in the Pacific. I'd like to just share some examples of our churches being inclusive and anti-racist. One is through the use of our liturgy. In our churches now, our liturgy language is very important, Indigenous languages. So our liturgy is offered in many languages. Also hymns. We had colonial English hymns that were brought to the islands that have been translated, but we also have our own Indigenous people that have composed hymns that tell our story of how we've encountered God. Speaking about language, we see the English language not as a language that has dominated us by default, but it's a common language that we all understand, also with together with our indigenous languages. And I think that Christian mission has there's space for, let's say, improvement or being rerouted, is by building our capacity to learn more and appreciate more the huge diversity that we have around the globe. By broadening our understanding and appreciating one another, we will be able to move on and work together to address other unjust structures in the world. I'd just like to share two examples of issues that are happening in our region. One is the impact of climate change that we often talk about. And caring for God's creation is a mission mark for us. Just being directly impacted by the effects of climate change in the Pacific, although we are of different races here in the Pacific, but we all suffer the same, and we tend to stand together when it comes to dealing with these issues. And the second was mentioned before, is the plight of the people of West Papua. For us in the Pacific, being community, being part of the Christian mission today means caring for one another, knowing and caring for what is happening around us as well. So these are just two examples to help contribute to this question about how we can move forward or be rerouted or change the way we look at our Christian mission.
Thank you, Seppi. And in fact, I think you said something that is, at least for me, of utmost importance. You spoke about the mission of the church actually being learning from the diversity of the world. And I think that completely reroutes our understanding of mission. Whereas earlier mission was described as going and telling something to someone, now mission seen as being learning something from others. So thank you very much for that very, very beautiful thought. Frank, how do you think mission can be rerouted to actually find, to speak about redemption? Frank, I think you have to unmute yourself.
No, I have we had to rethink about missions, especially if you come from my tradition, which was more conservative than conservative. and mission must be about change, radical change in the world. It's not just about individuals who have to change, but it's the world that needs to change. And so if we engage with the world for transformation so that we make it to be like Christ, then missions means we need to engage people in power. We need to engage people who have economic power. We need to make them understand that they will not have peace until everyone has peace. We need to make people understand justice is indivisible. You can't have justice in one place and not have justice in another place. And so for me, the missional dimension of the church is to make the world what Jesus died for. And we have really minimized the death of Christ to some event in history that had nothing to do with the cosmic reality. And we need to begin to I said at some stage, allow God to be God, because we colonized God. We colonized the gospel. We colonize even Jesus and make him to be what we want him to be. Whereas he came here to change the world in its totality rather than just focusing on some individuals. And I think if we have an understanding like that, that the individuals must change, but the objective is to change the world globally. My experience in the CCIA, Churches Commission on International Affairs, was quite extraordinary, because you go to a place where the church is dominant, you go to a place where there are minorities of minorities, you go to a place where it's survival theology than anything else instead of liberation theology. You learn, I've learned more about what Christ means to people in different situations. But what is missing is the global understanding of what the gospel is about to change the whole global reality, so that you don't have people having their conversation in G7 about the whole world, and the world is not part of the discussion. You know what I'm talking about? There was a meeting yesterday between Biden and Putin, but actually their discussions are about us as the world. And if it goes wrong there, it affects us. But I think the church needs to be able to go global and have an impact at a global level rather than just their own denominations and little corners of what you understand mission to be.
Thank you very much. Teora, would you like to come in and speak to this question of how mission can be rerouted towards redemption?
Kia ora, I think I was a little bit like Seppi. I didn't quite understand the question to begin with. And I'm not sure that I can offer anything more than Frank has offered, other than to say that perhaps I think in the same manner, and that perhaps what is needed globally is that prophetic voice. Because I think in my context anyway, there has been this shift to think about our isolated selves, particularly with the global pandemic. People have become insular in our context, where we're kind of internalizing what is happening in our context and not thinking broader, as you say, Frank, about this global Christian mission. So I think perhaps the only thing that I would offer is that prophetic voices seems to be missing in a lot of these various forums, just as you talked about, these key conversations that are going on at a global level that impact the world. There is not that prophetic voice in that space or in that forum. And I would say that's also probably true of the majority of New Zealand. If we look at our stats, the growing numbers of people are those who believe in no religion at all in our country. And Christians are becoming a minority within this context. And I think part of that is because that prophetic voice has slowly dissipated, particularly in our neck of the woods in Oceania. That's about all I can offer, sorry.
No, that's very good. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. May I ask the tech team to pull up this image now? And we're going to ask each one of the panelists here to offer a reflection on this. And as the participants can see, this is an image of people of faith building a wall of resistance, a multiple cultural, diverse wall of resistance against the Black Lives Matter, against the police brutality that led to the Black Lives Matter movement. So, Teora, how would you reflect on this? So what does this image bring to your mind? What is your prayer for the church? Or what would you like the church to demonstrate?
I think what this image kind of demonstrates to me is a capacity of fearlessness, to be radical and to be daring and to engage in every aspect of life. And I think that's what this image says to me. I would hope that the church would demonstrate the same sense of fearlessness in our prophetic voice, as we've just spoken about, in our capacity to further the Christian mission.
Thank you. Frank, this is an image that circulated around, and in fact, I mean, many have described it with Cornel West and others in Charlottesville in 2017 as clergy coming to the front, providing a wall of defense against activists who are being threatened by coercive forces. What does this image bring to your mind, relating it to your own struggle personally as well in the context of apartheid South Africa? And how would you like the church to be? Frank, unmute yourself, please.
Yes, I mute myself to get rid of the noises. When I looked at the picture, the first reaction, I didn't know where it comes from. My first reaction was to see a vulnerable church presenting itself against what I would call white supremacists with guns, etc. But what surprised me is that they were not threatened at all. And so it gave me another impression that the church can actually protest, but after the protest, the scourge of racism remains and does not go away. And that the picture of the global representative nature of that church says to me, you need to go beyond just protest into strategies to change the balance of forces in the world, to be able to make those who are powerful not be able to continue in the manner in which they continue in life. And I think that's what this picture actually, when I looked at it, told me, that yes, it's good to be protest, yes, it's good to act in solidarity, but actually you need strategies to change the balance of forces of the entities that cause the pain so that they can stop doing it, make it more costly for them to continue doing it. And to me, I mean, it's critical. We made it costly to support apartheid until it reached a stage where the superpowers had to give up. They had to dismantle the nuclear weapons and take them away, and even forced us to reach an agreement about how you control the chemical weapons they had given to the apartheid system. We reached a stage where they were forced to do that. And I think we need to reposition the church in a way that the powerful cannot continue without worrying about the consequences of what they are doing.
Thank you very much. I mean, to push that metaphor a bit, it's like moving out of the church into the streets, but then from there into the boardrooms where the policies and strategies are actually being made to affect change.
Yeah.
That's exactly the point. I mean, you can't just protest and feel good you are in the streets. You need to be able to say, what am I going to do to make sure that this pain does not continue? And there are other strategies to be rolled out to be able to force the powerful to understand they cannot continue with life as if nothing is happening.
Thank you. And I saw Henrietta nodding very much to this. So let's pass on to her and ask her, how do you reflect on this, and what do you dream the church to be?
Well, first of all, what I see is that, the boldness of the church to stand for justice. That's one thing. Sometimes some churches also are scared to go to the church and to express their concern. Secondly, this reflects the solidarity of the churches. But I agree with Frank that we have to move beyond that. I don't know whether this will work, but I would say prophetic voice can be also expressed in a dialogue within the powerful, with the military in this regard, as to how do we overcome this without fall into the violence. And just to use the, instrument of violence, it's not going to work. In many cases in Indonesia or around the world, it's already proved that the violence cannot always solve the problem. So how you sit together, and yeah, of course, this is a very hard work, because not only one time or two times, but sitting together in dialogue, in conversation about, the important issues with regard to justice for all. And many of these people also, the military, they're also actually struggle with that. Yeah. So how do we also touch the heart of the people? I think, the church need to speak on this prophetic, strong voice, but at the same also accompany the people who are sometimes pushing into this difficult situation, including those who the perpetrator of violence. Thank you.
Thank you. Seppi, I welcome you now to weigh in on this entire question about the image, how you respond to it, and what are your hopes and dreams for the church?
Thank you. My prayer for the church is meant to be vulnerable, like we see in the picture. And at first glance, I was thinking about us being the hands and feet of Christ in the world. But what stands out for me in this picture is that the people, or the clergy that are holding hands, they're actually facing the challenge. A lot of times, this shows the mission is outward focused. A lot of times we define mission, but most times without realizing we are holding hands, but facing inward with our backs to the challenge. But this is how I see being bold and facing the challenge, mission being outward focused.
Thank you very much. And Torsten now, I'm going to put this to you in two ways. Firstly, reflect on that particular image. Tell us what your hopes and the dreams of the church are. And then I'm going to very specifically ask you to, you have been part of this process in which the church really has demonstrated something. And you have come up with a publication on this called Mapping Migration. So if you could lead from that into introducing your publication to us and telling us what the church's Commission on Migration actually has been doing.
Yeah, thanks very much, Philip. The first thing, two wishes, prayers, the first one, and that is, of course, reflecting the reality of church in Europe. You, Philip, have been mentioning churches in Europe have been doing a lot in welcoming refugees and saving lives, and that is true. But I think we need to understand better that this, which is hospitality, cannot really work, be credible without fellowship. We need fellowship in equality centrally. So I think that is the challenge of the church, to move from being social, diaconal, to really be in the one body of Christ, where one part suffers, all the others suffers. That's the first one. And the second one, and that comes, of course, against my background as a white, middle-aged, middle-class, white European. I pray for the church in Europe to have the wisdom, the courage, and the faith to understand that giving up privilege is something we should do and we can do. Because I think we will need that. Otherwise, change will be very difficult. We need the challenges from elsewhere, but I think we also need, that faith, wisdom, and courage. And maybe, as you've given me the opportunity, I'd like to say a few words. I've earlier on been saying mapping is very central, mapping where you are as the church. And I, in this context, wanted to present a little brochure to you, which we have just officially published today. It's called Mapping Migration, and it is indeed looking at what European churches are doing in response to migration and in the response to being church together. And it is, on the one hand, encouraging, things are moving, but on the other hand, we had replies from 22 countries, 80 churches. If we asked, what do you do about leadership of people with migrant background, of ethnic minority background in your church? A third of the churches had something to say, the others said, we're not doing anything. And we asked about discrimination in the church. And a third of the people who responded says, yes, I've experienced discrimination because my particular denomination, my religious background, or I've experienced discrimination because of the issue of the color of my skin, my ethnicity. So I think there's lots of work to be done. We're also painting some positive pictures there of some positive developments. Churches becoming more looking more at diversity, but there's a long way to go. And as I said, in Europe, I think we need to start with saying, where are we at? Because very often discussion, everybody says, yeah, but we're all not racist, not understanding that it's not a question of being individually nice, but a question of structures and of sharing of responsibility, of power, of resources in a church which has been very, very unfair in doing exactly that. I'll share the link with you. It's available as a PDF, and I hope to have an ongoing conversation with you on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Torsten. Thank you for introducing this publication. But there's also this important aspect that you highlighted, that hospitality has a sense of home and power built into it. So it is actually, in a way, inviting people into your home, your space, but you still own it. But what you said about equality and fellowship dismantles that to open it up to a new space that we can build into the future. We have a little time. We've got 10 minutes, 5 minutes maybe for questions. And there is this one interesting biblical question that has come in. And I'm going to ask Seppi really to offer some insight into this. And the question says, what does the encounter of Jesus and the Canaanite woman teach us in our church today in our relation to the topic anti-racist in Christ?
Well, speaking about being anti-racist, something to think about for me is trying to put on the lens that God wears, like seeing people the way God would see them, whereby we are all diverse in different colors, but we're all the same. So throughout this session, that's what I've been thinking about, is how we see people the way that God sees them, the way Jesus sees them.
Thank you. We have another question which asks, which actually says that going global has a macro scale model built into it, which just two things. One is it makes the church's task kind of overwhelming on the one hand, but on the other hand, when we go global and do all these big things, we run the risk of alienating those who lie on the margins. Those who are not global, actually, in a way, and those who have been marginalized already by the process of globalization. So, Teora, let me ask you, can we perhaps reimagine this notion of going global?
Oh, that's an interesting question that we come across quite often as Indigenous peoples. Oftentimes our peoples and our wisdoms are reliant on being local. Our wisdoms as Indigenous peoples are intrinsically connected to our context in this land. So oftentimes going global means leaving our people behind. And so the propensity is not necessarily to go too global too quick, if you know what I mean. So as Indigenous Māori people, oftentimes we are required to go global to connect with other parts of the world because we are so isolated here in Aotearoa. But by the same token, we revert back to our own native wisdoms in the ways in which we interact globally. And you'll see this all the time. A perfect example is whenever our culture is misused or appropriated, the haka is probably the number one part of our culture that is continuously appropriated around the world. You will see as soon as this happens, our people are in there making protests, opposing whoever is doing it, as they are doing it, why they are doing it. So while we tend to revert to the sort of local context, we still have our finger in the global pie, I would say. So I don't think it's an either or. I think in order to be reflective of your own Indigenous context, you are required still to have a kind of global lens. So it's a little bit of both for me, and I don't know if that answers the question, sorry.
Right. We have another very interesting question that has actually come up. And this speaks actually from the Asian context, which says that, since independence that many of our countries have experienced, the churches are under local authority. Within this context, how do we speak about the language of racism? Are we racist, or is this really a Western construct, or should we really be using language of colonizer and colonized now? So how would you reflect on that, Henrietta? Is racism a term that we can still use in Asia?
Yeah. Well, I think the term racism usually it's limited in a way that different color or different, but in the context of Asia, different social background, different economic background, different ethnicity, different religion sometimes becomes the issue of discrimination. So if we only use the word racist, I think it's a little bit limited compared to the practice of injustices and practice of discrimination that happen in this world. Yeah. I would like also to see, for instance, the issue of there are so many people from Indonesia migrated to the different parts of the world. So yes, in the country of receiving countries, the issue of hospitality is very important. But the country where the migrants come from, the issue of how do you call that? Accompany them against the fears, of different culture, of different society, of different religion is very important. So I think there should be a kind of discussion among the churches where the migrants come from and the churches that in the country that receive migrant workers, so that we can understand more holistically about the issue faced by the migrants. And in that regards, what do we, it is my hope that the church today become the church of strangers. There are many people feeling stranger in different places, even within one country, even within one localities, because of the rapid changing of the society, and not everybody can be at the same tone facing the rapid changes in the society. And also, of course, the alienation of the nature. So we are facing the ecological crisis. So slowly the nature also becomes strange to us. Yeah. So how do the church become the church of the strangers? I think it's called for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've had a very interesting conversation today that's raised questions about the nature and identity of the church, the marks of the church, and has looked forward to see what can the church do or be to embody this model of being anti-racist in Christ. We've seen our initiatives that we have made in the past, but I've also noted the difficulty in many of these and the patronizing paternalism that have been part of it. I will now welcome our three staff from the CWM and World Council of Churches to bring this set of webinars to a close. So over to you, my friends.
Thank you, Philip. So friends, we have come to the end of the 4 days of these conversations on anti-racism in Christ. This has been an insightful online event with so many rich contributions from outstanding panelists throughout the week, a remarkable moderator, as well as so many of you who attended and joined us from around the world, and some of you in the middle of the night. I would like to thank each one of you deep from my heart profusely for journeying with us throughout this week and wrestling with these difficult conversations. About some of the learnings from these conversations that I'm taking with me. Right from the very first session, we were reminded that whiteness is a misrepresentation of the biblical teaching, that God has chosen Jesus Christ and that Jesus Christ comes to the line of those who were rejected and not the ones who rejected. We followed on mission agencies and their legacies, and we were reminded of the hidden violence behind the well-intended benevolence, the mentality of without us, it would have been much worse. Yesterday, when we discussed the impact of last year's Black Lives Matter protests, it was noted that most of the time communities have been isolated, and therefore solidarity between struggling communities is essential when we work for racial justice, because unity and solidarity means strength. We also have been challenged to decolonize the World Council of Churches as well as the ecumenical movement. And today, this morning, when asked who is leading the anti-racism work, we were told that the church is not there yet. The church needs to look at things from the point of view of the marginalized, the oppressed, we were told, and that there needs to be radical transformation within the church to become anti-racist. And we can't do so until we are there in a position of power. So these are some of the learnings I'm taking with me, but much more can be said about this week. Future events will be organized until the end of this year as we journey towards the WCC Assembly in Karlsruhe next year. And stay tuned as we will be organizing more events this year and next year. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, friends. Thank you, Sigma, for your words there, which capture so beautifully everything we have done. I want to echo a few things. On behalf of Council for World Mission, our thanks to the World Council of Churches for sharing this platform with us, and as we work together in a commitment to this agenda to continue in this work. So I am grateful for that, and to all the panelists, the moderators, and the communications team and the interpreters. It has been a rich and powerful event. I want to reflect a few things just quickly before I hand to Seb. In our conversations, it's clear that as we confront racism, that apology is not enough. It's clear that protest is not enough. And it's also clear that our calling is not enough. So only change is enough. And that, we've been posed with many times, how far will we go? Frank, are you what Christ meant you to be? And I speak on a mission agency that's trying to confront its legacies of slavery, its history, and its present. As an organization trying to ask, in the light of these things then, how do we understand mission as fundamentally an aspect of reparatory and restorative justice in the world? How do we come to creation? How do we come to human relations? How do we come to our politics? How do we come to ourselves? And how do we come to our frankly useless churches and enable restorative justice and reparatory power? So for all of this and all of this inspiration, I'm so grateful, and thank you, friends. And Seth, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Philip. Thank you, Sigma. And again, I reiterate the comments of my colleagues earlier, and that is to say a very big thank you to our panelists today and to all the panelists this week who have accompanied us on this journey, and for the wisdom, the expertise, and insights that you have shared. I also want to thank our excellent moderator, Philip Peacock. Thank you for facilitating the conversations this week. And 4 days, we know, is a tough call, but you have done it really well. So thank you. And to all the people behind the scenes that you don't see who actually make this production possible, we want to thank you because we know that without you, we wouldn't be running as good as we are. And finally, I just want to just say 3 things that I've taken away from this conversation. And the first is to say that we have a long way to go still in terms of interrogating our whiteness and colonialism in our theologies, and most ultimately in how they play out in our practices, because that's where I keep hearing the rub, is how we actually practice. We may have fine, good theologies, but in practice, we're actually very lacking. Secondly, is to acknowledge our complicities in the perpetuation of racism. And today, I think, this last conversation, we have come full circle back to this pivotal question again about our Christian identity, and that is, what does it mean to be church in the world? What does it mean to be vulnerable, or to be Christ's vulnerable body in the world today? And I guess what this means for me and in my work, for all our work, is that it emphasizes the need for us to continue to do the redemptive, restorative work of anti-racism in our institutions and in both our theologies and intentional practice. And this, I believe, is the cross we continue to bear in terms of staying with the struggle. So thank you very much, everyone, and much blessings in this continuing work that we all do.
Thank you, everyone, participants, panelists, organizers, the tech team, those who did all the hard work to bring these webinars for you. Thank you very much. Have a good remainder of the day, however much time you have left today. And thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much. Bye.
Kia ora, hei kona mai.